our updates and be part of our conversation squad.
I want to start with a little on a personal note. Um, Many of you may not know that Vikram and I are married, and Ajay and Neeta have been friends for a very, very long time. And I remember Manthan when it was just a little piece of paper with names scribbled on it that Vikram and Ajay would pore over, while Neeta and I watched with much amusement and a lot of skepticism. And it's really lovely to see, the way it's grown. Um, I I never felt comfortable agreeing to come and speak here because I wasn't sure how much of it would be because of knowing the organizers and how much would be the value of my own work. But just a month ago, or even a little longer before than that, maybe Ajay asked me to speak, and Ajay has been such a source of strength for my work that this time I could not refuse. So Ajay, wherever you are, I hope you're watching, and I hope I live up to your expectations. Okay. So, um, telling color by smell, memory, and song. It sounds exotic, I know, but if you think about it, if I were to ask you, how do you know your food, or how do you know the sari that you wear, you would say, I know my food by the way it tastes, the way it smells. I know my sari from, how it feels. And I know it from memory because I've worn it before, I've tasted it before. That's the memory that tells me this is what it is. I recollect. I know because I can recollect. And then once we've done that, we will give it a name. So we will say, this is the brinjal from Nellore. This is the mango from Hyderabad. This is the Bangiripalli mango. Say you were to ask, where does the song come from? You would ask, who is the singer? You would not ask, where does the song come from? And then you would name the singer. So you have, actually, the way you know is always through smell, memory, and and song, because there is always emotion, affect, which is attached to this. But what you do is you give them names. Once you know them, you give them names. And once you've given them a name, you somehow only remember the name. You only you think that you know through the name. What I would like to do in today's talk is talk about people who don't give their knowledge names, who don't talk about their knowledge, but still know through smell, memory, and song. And those people that I want to talk about are handloom weavers, but mostly all crafts people, dyers, people who make color. We still have something like 63 million craftspeople in the country, 3 million handloom weavers alone, families. And if who are always precariously um, eking out a livelihood. Some of them do very well, but many of them are below the poverty line. And they have to survive in the market. So it's about the value that their product gets in the market. They're competing with machines. But what I want to propose in this talk is that what we need to value about them is their knowledge, not their labor, not just their labor, not look at what they know as labor, but try and value their knowledge. Because if we don't do that, we are going to lose them. Now, as Ram said, I worked for many years in an NGO working to support livelihoods, because I was with people, and along many people believed that the best way in which you can support craftspeople is by taking them to the market and taking their products to the market and making sure they get the right price. And we did it through this experiment called development, where we were the people who went and helped them because they needed help. And this is how we saw it. We were strong, they were weak, because and this came from a very it was also about financial vulnerability. They were much more financially vulnerable than us, so it was easy to think of them as being weak. But after 15 years, what became very clear is that these discourses of livelihood, of development, they're not very empowering for weavers, because what it does, it moves the agency to us, it moves the ownership to us. And as we've seen recently in the Sabyasachi furor that has happened, the knowledge of the craftspeople becomes owned by either the development organization or the retailer or the designer.
Sorry,
And
Annapurna, can you come a little closer? The volume is low.
okay. Okay, is this better? Okay. So what tends to happen is that while we think we are helping them, what we are actually doing is taking from them. We're taking away the ownership of their knowledge. And that is not something that we immediately realize, because of course the livelihood is very important and that job that we are doing is very important. But the point at which the market rewards us more than it's rewarding them is a point where you have to stop and think. You have to stop and think, is this really a good way? Or is there a better way? Not that this is a bad way, but is there a better way? And that's how actually I went into doing the PhD. After almost, 15, more than 15 years of working with, cooperatives, with marketing, with setting up business models, trying to work with policy. So I trained as an engineer. So I went into a field that is looking at, that looks at the technological aspects of knowledge. So what I tried to do was try to talk about handloom weaving as technology. But what people would ask me when I went into the field was, well, if you're really talking about craft, you're talking about something that people do with their hands, we have science and technology, we have real technology, we have the technology that lets you do things better, more efficiently. Why do you need craft? Why do you need this manual labor? Isn't it time that it should go? Let it die. Its time is over. So we should just let it go. So that was the battle I had to fight with the theoreticians, with the modern science and technology people who did studies of modern science and technology. But I didn't have only a problem at that side. I had a problem at this side also, because craft people would say, oh, we do it from our experience, we do it from our ability and our way to know. Why do we need theory? We don't need theory. And it was quite a battle to explain to them that you need theory, because if you're not theorizing your knowledge, people are thinking that you're only doing labor. You don't show the concepts, you are not able to show the mathematics, you're not able to show the science, you're not able to show these things. People think that you're only doing labor and you can be replaced by a machine. So you have to be able to conceptualize what you're doing. So these were the questions that informed my PhD. So from the side of theory, I had to show it was technology. Now, if I had to show it was technology, what are the characteristics of technology? Technology is something that can be standardized, right? And you don't think of craft as something that can be standardized. You think it's something that every time is different. It's artistic, it's creative. So how does standardization even work in something like handloom weaving in craft? And then the opposite side of the problem, which is, oh, they're doing traditional things. They make the same things over and over again. How do they innovate? And if there's no innovation, there's no technology. So these were the questions. So the frame that I was given was, okay, you have to show us how handloom weaving standardizes. You have to show how it innovates in order for us to accept that, well, it's actually technology. Now, the other question, which is a more, there's an underlying kind of assumption that, even when you say it's technology, and, even if I do a theoretical explanation and manage to convince you, which I hope to do in the next 20 minutes, there is an underlying question of, but it's drudgery. Weavers are working with their bodies, and it's hard labor. Why do we want them to do it? Why should we want craftspeople to stay in that misery, in that drudgery? Why are you even arguing for that? And machines can do it better in any case. And they're more, weavers' livelihoods are not sustainable. Machines are more efficient, they're more modern. They will give you what you want. So why should you actually even make this argument? So these are the two kinds of questions that I hope to be answering in the next 20-25 minutes. If you're from Hyderabad, my story is people with people you know. They're all the people who I worked with in the last 25 years. They're the people I've made my journey with. And because this is not an individual journey, this has been very much a collective journey. I've worked with people, and I've written about the people I know and the people I worked with. So this is really, Ram has his own role to play. When I first started the PhD in 2010, I was not accepted by the academics. They saw a 40-year-old woman who had not been in a classroom for 20 years and was struggling to read and write. And I desperately wanted to be validated. So I told my guide, I want to write a paper. I want to start with writing a paper. And my first paper as an academic was actually for EPW when Ram was editing it. And I approached him and said, I'm writing this paper, and I along with my supervisor and the person I was working with then in the NGO. And I did not expect at all to be replied to or heard. But I got a reply within, I think 6 hours, saying, this is very interesting work. Send me the paper. I want to see it. So it kind of encouraged me and set me off on this journey. And that's what I mean, that, my journey is people with Hyderabadi souls. Okay. So telling color by smell, memory, and song. Now, I will use a little bit of theoretical jargon. I'm sorry for this, but it's to give you a sense of the kind of translations I had to do from the kind of knowledge that I understood as being by smell, memory, and song, but also having to show it as something that is technological and scientific and explicable. So there is this, whenever this kind of knowledge is explicated in theoretical work, they call it tacit knowledge. Knowledge that is of the body that cannot be explicated. And there is this kind of mystery about tacit knowledge. It's something that, because it cannot be explicated, there is something very changeable and not very certain about it. Now, Harry Collins, who is one of the people who's theorized tacit knowledge, he talks about 3 kinds of tacit knowledge. He says somatic tacit knowledge, which is of the body. It's like riding a bicycle. Collective tacit knowledge, which is tacit because it's known socially, like rules that you know because you're part of a group, like you have to take your slippers off before you go into a temple. It's not something that's, of course, now nobody will tell you take your slippers off. You just take it off because it's something that all of you know together. And relational tacit knowledge, which is tacit knowledge which has not yet been made explicit, but could be made explicit if you want it. But for whatever reasons of secrecy or nobody bothered with it, was not considered important enough, it's not. Now, indigo dyeing, which is the knowledge that I'll be talking about today, which is a process that has to be of making color using natural indigo through fermentation. So you have to, it's a 15-day process of fermenting the indigo in a pot that's buried in the ground and taking care of it till it gives you the color. So you have to keep adding things and smelling it and making sure it's healthy before it gives color. But the color that it gives is so fast is so good that we have samples of indigo from something like, 3rd BC. Even the fabric will fade, but the color will still stay. That's the kind of fastness that this natural indigo gives us. And it had been lost to us for almost 20 years. But the person I was working with, Usdama, I and all the group, that we went and found this old man called Yellappa, who agreed to teach this color again to younger dyers so that we could revive it. This was in the late 90s. Now, indigo dyeing is a knowledge that has all three kinds of tacit knowledge. Yellappa would tell the color by smell. He would smell it and he would know whether the color was fast or not. He would say it has to smell like a flower, then you know it's right. So it was tacit because it was of the body. It was collective because it had been forgotten. The indigo dyeing process had been forgotten. But in the collective memory of people who remembered that beautiful indigo, even though it was not present at the moment that we were looking for it, it was there. So it was tacit knowledge because it was memory, which was collective. So it was also collective tacit knowledge. It was relational because it was not that you could not write a scientific formula and a recipe for it. Of course you could, but it hadn't been done because it was not important for Yellappa to write a formula or write it down because he was telling the color by smell. So a recipe was not at all important for him to write. So this kind of knowledge was tacit in all three kinds of ways. Now, in this kind of tacit knowledge, how do you standardize? Because if you're telling color by smell, how can you standardize that color? Now, to explain how our frameworks of standardization actually don't grasp this kind of knowledge, I would like to give an example from when I started working with weavers. We used to go and ask weavers to give us the color that the market wanted. So for example, say I'm slightly fictionalizing this story for ease of telling it to you. This is not the order in which happened, but I'm going to present it like this. So imagine that we go to a weaver and it happened. So I said, okay, can you make this color for me? Do you know what the name of this color is? And the weaver said, oh, this is Damayanti. Can you make Damayanti for me? Yes, of course I can make Damayanti for you. It's a lovely blue, deep blue. Will you make it? Yes, we will make it. I come back to Hyderabad. 4 weeks later, I get 100 meters of that fabric. It's not blue, it's green. So I go back and say, oh, but this is not the color I wanted. So which color did you want? Show them the blue. He says, oh, Damayanti. Fine, I'll make it. But I said, I didn't get Damayanti. I got this color. And then I decide, okay, this guy doesn't know how to standardize colors. He doesn't even know the name of the color. He's an idiot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give him a little sample of color, number it 01, 02, and tell him, make this color. Okay, fine. He makes that color. That is how that system works for 15 years. I go back to him to do my PhD. And this time I ask him, instead of telling him, I ask him, what is Damayanti? And he tells me, Damayanti is depth of color, because what I am standardizing is depth. I'm not standardizing the color itself, whether it's blue, green, brown, yellow, I don't care, because that comes from the packet. What is my capability? My capability is standardizing how deep the color should be. So when I say this is Damayanti, what I'm telling you is that I'm standardizing depth. And I had worked with them for 15 years without realizing what they considered knowledge. Now, let's go to the idea of memory. How does one standardize memory? How does one standardize collective knowledge? And this is where, again, when I went back and started, so I spoke to Manam Viswanath, who was the peon in the Punduru Society, Cooperative Society, who used to be a weaver. And he quit weaving because it became unsustainable, went off to the city because he had to find dowries for his daughters. And then he doesn't talk much about it. I think he couldn't survive. He came back, but this time he had taken to alcohol, so he couldn't weave anymore so well. I was looking for somebody who had failed at weaving to interview. And that's a whole other story I can tell you about Manam Viswanath. But for now, I only want to say one part of what I asked him. And that was, I said, so why did you leave weaving? And he said, Adi nalugurito kudina pani, which in Telugu, in English, it means it is a work that has to be done together with 4 people. And not 4, he means with many people. And what he meant was that you had to have the spinner, dyer, warper, sizer, weaver, the cooperative, the retailer, even the consumer. All of these people had to work together to make a particular product. And he told me, when the machine started going fast, all of us had to start working faster and faster. He said, it got to a point where I went to the bathroom and my wife would say, come back quickly. At that point, I fell out of weaving because I could not keep up the pace of the younger people who were weaving. Now, this might sound very ridiculous, except just now, the German state is actually considering that when you go to the bathroom, you should swipe out because that is personal time. It's not professional time. So you see what these ideas of productivity do to us as people. So anyway, to come back to Manam Viswanath, it set me thinking, what does it mean to be collective? Now, here, again, it's about standardizing this collectivity. What would it mean to standardize this kind of collective? So here I'd like to give 2 examples. There is a number in the I will call it the socio-technical ensemble of weaving that is called a count. If you're familiar with cotton saris, when you walk into a shop and you touch the fabric and you say, what count is this? And if it's a Mangalagiri sari, they will tell you it's 60-40 or it's 60-60 or you'll say 80 count. Or those days they used to say the Venkatgiri sari was 120 count. No, so the higher the number, the finer the fabric. So now what is this number? To give you a technical explanation, during the time of the British, every box was 10 pounds. 10 pounds is 4.5 kgs. Now, that was divided into 2. And in those 4.5 kilos, you had to have, the yarn was in hanks. Hanks are like long, wound yarn. So each hank has exactly 1,000 meters. Now you can imagine that in 4.5 kilos, if you have to have 1,000 meters of hanks, how many hanks could you have? So the thinner the yarn, the more hanks you can have in the same weight, right? And the thicker the yarn, the less hanks you can have. So if you had 10 hanks in 4.5 kilos, you can imagine that the yarn was very thick. But if you had 100 hanks in the same 4.5 kilos, then you can imagine that the yarn was very thin. So this is the count. Now, what does the count tell the spinner? It tells the spinner how thin or thick he has to spin it. What does it tell the dyer? it tells him how many hanks he has to take to get a certain weight. What does it tell the warper? Tells the warper how many threads he has to take per inch. So if it is the count is 60, then he has to take 60 threads per inch. What does it tell the sizer? It tells the sizer how thick. The sizer is the person who puts the starch on the yarn to make the yarn steady enough for weaving. It tells him how thick he has to make the solution, how much of solution he has to put on that yarn. What does it tell the weaver? Well, if you've got 60 threads per inch in the warp, it tells him he has to beat at least 60 times in the weft. What does it tell the retailer? It tells the retailer how fine that cloth is going to be. What does it tell the consumer? How it's going to feel when you drape it. Is it going to feel heavy? Is it going to feel light? Is it going to be dense? Is it going to be airy? This is what this count tells us. So what does this count do? It's a coordinating standard. It's a standard that actually coordinates between all the different activities that have to happen. So there is a standard, there is a count. But what it does is basically it tells you that, okay, let me give you an example. Recently, I was working, there is a project called Malka. If you're from Hyderabad, many of you know this project. They have set up small spinning units. They've been working on setting up small spinning units. Now, in one of the villages where they were making where there were weavers weaving this yarn, there was a peculiar count that they were using. They were using a count of 27. Now, an engineer who was trying to make this more standard came up to them and said, why do you want to use 27? Why don't you use either 25 or 30? Isn't that easier? And there was a huge resistance to moving to either 25 or 30. And this engineer could not understand why. Because what was there about this odd number? So if you have 27, then you're counting everything in 27s. 25 or 30 is much easier to count with. So why are you using this 27? And then when we actually sat down and talked to them, what we found was that actually, because this yarn was being hand spun, it didn't have this uniformity that the machine spun number had. So if you're machine spinning it, at every point the count is 27, is 25 or 30. But when you're hand spinning, some places it's slightly thinner, some places it's slightly thicker. So what happens to the count? It's actually variable. And in order to indicate that variable count, they prefer to have that number 27. Because what it would do was it would communicate all across the ensemble that this is a slightly unstable number. This is not that stable 25 or 30. So even in that instability, they were able to standardize. So this is the kind of standardization coordination that happens within these collectives. Okay, so I've told you a little bit about standardization. Now, what about innovation? You look at a kanchi sari, a red kanchi sari with a gold border. It looks like it's been there forever. So where is the innovation? Now there might be enough of a market for that kanchi sari with that border, but as you progress, with the ordinary fabric, everybody wants something new. So where do weavers innovate? So here again, I want to use the example of the Uppada sari. Now, Ghanshyam Sarode is also somebody from Hyderabad. In the 90s, he was an LIC agent, he says, who was trying to make his way in Bombay. And he found that people were very interested in Paithani saris. And he comes from there. And he understood. So he tried to go to Paitan and make these saris so that he could sell them. Found that, people were not willing to make these saris. And the speciality about those saris is the extra weft, that you put in an extra booty into the sari, into the border actually, but you could also put them into the technique was the jamdani technique. So he went to Venkatgiri where he heard that there was Jamdani and found that they were not willing to make it anymore. So he went to Uppada. And there he managed to find some people who would make this extra weft. Now, he started in a small way with 3 or 4 looms at that time. By the 2000s, by the time I went to do my research in 2010, that village that had 500 weavers had grown to 10,000 weavers. They were all making these Uppada Jamdani saris. And it was a completely new sari because this was not something that had been done before. There had been no Uppada Jam. There had been an Uppada sari, there was the Jamdani technique. But the Uppada Jamdani was a completely new innovation introduced by Ghanshyam Sarode. Now, what was it that he had done? He had got them to insert these beautiful booties into the sari. But what could make 10,000 weavers suddenly able to weave this very, very, very difficult technique? And what I found was actually that what had been introduced into the ensemble was the computer. So what the weavers had done was they had used the computer to help them make these patterns. Now, when I went and looked very closely at the pattern, I found that where previously there had been beautifully, differentiated paisleys, the new saris actually had a little pixelation. There was a little, like a bad resolution on the, when you have bad resolution on the computer screen, the way you get pixelations, you had pixelations. So I said, what is happening here? And they said, that's how we do it. And then I watched and I found that actually a computer programmer was making these patterns. So I went to him and said, look, introducing the computer into this beautiful handmade process, you're ruining the product because you're creating these pixelations. And this is a young boy called Balaji, who's now the head of the Weaver Service Center, I think, in Vijayawada. He told me, but this is not what I am doing. This is what is happening on the loom. I said, no, but what you're doing on the screen is what they're putting on the loom. So you are the one who is making this problem. And he said, no, you're not getting it. So while I was sitting there, the weaver came and sat next to him. And he said, I want a mango with 2 leaves. So this boy pulls out, whole folder with mango with 2 leaves. And then the weaver says, make it smaller, make it bigger. And he figures out the resolution and then says, stop. This is the resolution I want. And then he takes that graph. He makes him print a graph and he takes it. Now what is happening is, because the weaver thinks digitally, the warp and weft is exactly the same digital as the screen, he is able to actually use the computer to figure out how much labor he wants to put in. Because if he pixelates it very finely, then he has to change the insertion every time he turns the shuttle. But when he changes the resolution, he can do it every 4 times, which actually brings the work and the time that he uses to do it almost down by 30%. Now what happens? The sari still has the value of the 100%. So he's now able to sell the sari at much lesser cost. So this was a kind of an innovation that they had made, but they had made it by subordinating the computer, by using their digital knowledge to make something new. Now, they hadn't just done this for the design. They did it for many of the calculator functions. So they used it for making the graphs, they used it for figuring out the layouts, they used it for calculating the prices, for all of that. Now, the question is, then you would ask is this really an innovation on the loom? Definitely an innovation on the loom, because the products that come out are being made by the loom. But the site of the innovation is not the loom itself. It's in the head of the weaver who uses the computer as a tool to make the innovation on the loom. But the way we understand innovation is that unless the loom itself progresses, that's the way we understand innovation. So therefore, the innovation that the weaver has done, where he's used his head to actually make new designs on the computer, and it's an innovation, it's an artistic innovation, it's an economic innovation. He's made his loom more efficient without changing a thing on the loom. But do we see it as innovation? No, we don't. So, and there is a reason for this. It's not just that we don't see it as innovation, the weaver also doesn't see it as innovation. So when I go and tell the weaver, so I went back to Ghanshyam Sarode and said, oh, what a fantastic thing you've done. And then he said, yeah, it's a fantastic thing. I've got them the GI also. Now the GI is the geographic indicator, which allows a particular location to own its traditional product. What does that mean? So what the weavers did is, once they had made this innovation, they recast it as tradition. So they gave it as history. They said the Bobbili princess used to wear this sari. And, the Rani of so-and-so used to wear this sari. And then because they'd made it in these vibrant, beautiful colors that we associate with royalty, the consumers completely bought into it. And Ghanshyam Sarode giving it a GI, having invented it, having innovated it, then calling it tradition. So there is this way of recasting innovation as tradition in order to actually reach the customer and give it value in the market. So then how can I theorize it as innovation? Neither does it fit the innovation framework of science and technology, which expects progress in the machine, nor does it fit the weaver's own idea. But I had to do it. So I said, okay, what to do? Now, while this was happening, I was also with musicians. I was also talking a lot to musicians. Now, there is this very, very famous and scholarly musician called Vedavalli Amma in Chennai, who I used to visit regularly. And in one of her concerts, she did something very similar. She sang something very new, did something very innovative, and then said, don't think this is an innovation. My guru used to do this. So I went to her house and I said, wow, you're such an innovator, because she was seen as somebody very conservative and orthodox. So I wanted to, encourage her a little bit. I said, so you're such an innovator. You're doing this. You've done exactly what my weavers do. You do this very innovative thing, and then you call it tradition. And then I had, I think, the worst half an hour of my life. While she almost threw me out of her house. She said, why for do I need this very, very, very immodest word? What is this? I did it. I did this innovation. I didn't do nothing. It came to me by the grace of God. It was not there before, and then it was there. How could it come to me? How could that knowledge come from me? It had to come from divine grace. Now I was completely stumped, because she was also completely discarding this idea of innovation. Now, on the other side, my Dutch supervisor also gave me a little bit of a heart attack, because I used Schumpeterian theory to show that there was product, process, market innovation. And I said, see, my weavers are innovating. See how well I fitted into your framework. Now, we were sitting in the Leiden train station, because I used to travel from India and go there, spend a month there, meet my supervisors, come back and write. So on one side was my supervisor from my department, the Weaver Biker. There was Luke Box, who was sitting in front of me, who was my other supervisor, who actually understood the problems of development and the problems that development had created for craftspeople very well. So I was sitting there, and there was an empty chair. And then he leaned forward and he held my hands, this elderly senior scholar. And he said, Annapurna, you've done a fantastic job. you've become a perfect Dutch scholar. But if there was an Indian colleague sitting in this empty chair, he would ask me, where is the Indian scholar? And I was completely shocked because I said, isn't that what I'm supposed to do? I'm supposed to come here and show you that my knowledge fits your criteria. And he said, no, you're supposed to come here and tell me what your viewers know, how they know. Don't tell me how they fit into Schumpeter's skill set. So I had these two shocks where my theory was completely rejected by our traditional knowledge bearers and also by the modern scientists. So then I went back and decided to talk to musicians to see how they talk about knowledge. So how do they know? And they have this framework of sadhana and manodharma. So how do they talk about innovation? They don't talk about innovation, they talk about creativity. They talk about creativity as manodharma, the thing that comes from sadhana. So what is sadhana? Sadhana is repetitive work. You have to build skill through repetition. You have to learn rules through imitation. You have to become fluent through variation. These are all steps. And then in the moment of performance, when you have to suddenly performance, there is uncertainty. And then there is a moment of a breakthrough. And that breakthrough, the elder musicians call it the moment of divine bliss. And they say it requires a guru to show you the way. And that moment of creativity is experienced as completely an absence of self. You have lost yourself at that moment. Therefore, it cannot be an innovation that you did. That is why they disown that moment. And it is meditate. Now, interestingly enough, when I went back to science, I found that there was a complete analogy in cognitive learning of the exact same steps. That is 10 years of practice for creative development, importance of heuristics, which are learned only through imitation, learning fluency in order for flexibility, where the musicians had called variation, here they were calling it flexibility. Then when you test it for the actual creative ability, it was done through problem solving. And there was the eureka moment. Suddenly you would know. But except here too, it is an unconscious creative process. But that creative moment is seen as the moment of I in science. While in our knowledge systems, it is seen as something that comes to you by grace. It comes to you from a consciousness that is beyond the self. And you call it divine. So what became clear is whether it is craft, music, or science, you had to have this repetitive work, or what you call drudgery, what you call imitation, what you call just variation. Before you had that breakthrough, you had to build these steps, you had to learn through these steps before you could even think of being innovative. So if you wanted innovation, you can't do it without having all these steps. So without craft, what you call craft, you cannot have innovation. So where we started with this question of, yes, but can craft have innovation? Now actually we're saying, well, actually, you know what? You can't have innovation if you don't have craft. So I want to come back to this question of this underlying question that we started with, which is, really should people be doing this work? Should really be people be doing this drudgery? And shouldn't they replace it with machines? And here, relating to the first part of the question is, if it is not explicable, is it knowledge? Is where we started with, because science is all about explication. So we are discounting what the viewer knows because he doesn't speak of it. Well, I've shown you that he maybe cannot speak of it. It's embedded in a way that you cannot speak. Smell, memory, song. How do you speak of these things? How do you name these things? So it's a kind of knowledge that actually is diminished when you name it. It is complete only when you actually do it. So this is the kind of knowledge you have. If you discount it as labor, we lose that knowledge. That is one part of it. The other part of it is that at least what Yellappa the dyer would say is, not everything can be known. It's not that I don't want to speak of it. I don't even know it. I don't know what the blue will be tomorrow. And I want the possibility of a better blue. I want the possibility of a surprise. And if I know everything and I speak everything and it's all certain, where is that going to come from? Where is that hope going to come from? That there is a better tomorrow, that there is a better blue. So it's not just about what is knowable, it is the not knowable that is equally important. And this is where I talk about mathematics on the loom. That if the weaver is sitting there and he has, say, a 60 count, I've told you what a count is. So 60 threads per inch. There are 54 inches on the loom. So 60 into 54, the number of threads that he has in the warp. When he is beating the weft, he has if you want to create a square of 54 into 72, the into 54 into 72 is his canvas for making a single pattern. If he is using a single shed, if he's using 2, 3, 4 sheds, then the number multiplies. Now, every time he picks a thread, he's picking one up or one down. It's a digital machine that has the possibilities of 54 into 60 into 54 into 60 possibilities every time he's picking it. This is the kind of computation that is possible in his head. If a computer had to pick it, it would take it 3 days to make a choice. Every single thread, if it had to compute, possibility it had to compute. So how is the weaver making these decisions? He's making these decisions by programming that knowledge into his feet when he moves the heddles. He's making it when he counts with his fingers. And he's making it when he puts colors into the threads, and then he can count using his eyes. And then he runs the algorithm using all of these units. That's how he makes these decisions. And they are much faster than any computer can make it. Now, there is nothing unpredictable about it. The minute he has picked a thread, there will be an outcome on the design. There is nothing mystical about it. It is extremely causal. But because of the huge number of possibilities, it is not predictive. It is not the same thing over and over again. He can make changes as he's moving things. And this is what he is computing. Now, instead of that kind of knowledge, what do we have today? How do we produce fabric today? 10% of all greenhouse gases come from textiles. To give you some context, air travel is 11.6%. From textiles, we get 10%. 20% of pollution of water comes from the fashion industry. Today, landfills, 30% is clothes. The average American is throwing away 40 kilos of clothes every year. I'm sure we won't be far behind. Now, is that sustainable? Clearly not. But then, neither are we sustaining this knowledge of smell, memory, and song. So where are we in between these two? So with this question, I'd like to end this session. Thank you very much.
You're muted, Sujata.
Annapurna, that was absolutely simply fascinating. I mean, I've just been reading some of the articles that you have written, but I never realized the complexity and the depth that you have gone into in this talk. You know, and for a people and a country that is so obsessed with politics, religion, and cricket, you've really taken us on a completely different trajectory of thinking and mind. And next time I see a weaver, I promise you, I'll be far more respectful and much more interested in the science of his weaving. So my first question that has been coming into my mind when I heard you and when I read you was, you have such, as an engineer, such a quantitative mind. How is it that you got into the romance of weaving? I mean, you know, dealing with something of spiritual aspects of it, the mind, the memory, the senses, the sensory perceptions, the unknowables. These are all frontiers of a person seeking truth and seeking spiritual knowledge. It's almost that. That's what I kind of thought of when you were giving the analogy of music, because I saw that in every craft, whether you take sculpture, pottery, every artist feels that Eureka movement is a divine grace, you know. So rightly put it that it can't be associated with an egoistic principle of I. So that is so qualitative. So how did you make that own transition in your own mind from a very quantitative, precise scientist, engineer to something so imprecise as creativity, which can't be defined?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I'm going to answer it in two ways. One is from my field work, and one is from the theoretical frame. So when I first started working with weavers and dyers, we were reviving natural dyes. So I went with books, with recipes. Uzrama said, you have to go and teach them. I was an engineer. I thought anything can be learned from a book. So we had recipe books from colonial times. I just picked it up and said, yeah, I can do this. Now, the weavers had the practical knowledge. Salim, who's a master dyer, was the driver. He's a master at Indigo dyer today. He was the driver. And he watched me struggle to even light the wooden poi. I couldn't even get a fire going. And he said, okay, I'll do it. You just move. So I would stand there with my book and they would actually do the work. Now, there was one particular thing that this is a story I tell often, but I like it because it shows, you know. So we would, when we first started doing the dyeing, you basically what you do is you boil the color and you dye the yarn in it. So we did that. It was a nice pink color. We were in Chennur. The local coordinator, Satyana, he got himself a lovely shirt made out of that thing. When we went back next time, we said, how's that shirt doing? And his wife had a twinkle in her eye. She said, you didn't see he was wearing it. So then we looked at him and he is wearing a white shirt. The color had completely run out. But there were pink threads sewn on it because the sewing had been done in pink. And then we were, horrified and apologetic. And then we went and read some more, and we found that actually you had to dip the yarn in myrobalan. You had to treat it with tannin before you put it in the color. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fast. So we told the weavers, do this. So then they said, no, we're not doing. It's too much work. So then Salim and I decided we will do the myrobalan in Hyderabad, send it to Chennur. They would do that. And we got this beautiful red. It was the red like the kind of shirt that Vikram is wearing. And then they got excited. They said, okay, we'll also do it. Then they didn't get it. They only got a pink. Dip in this, only pink. So then, it was like, okay, they're not telling us something. They're keeping something secret. They were accusing us of all kinds of things. So as a joke, I said, what the yarn needs is a bus ride from Hyderabad to Chennur. Only then it will turn red. Now, the next thing I knew, Odalu, the weaver, created this beautiful red and showed us. And I said, how did you do it? And he said, it's simple. After doing the myrobalan, you have to cure the yarn for 15 days. That's what that bus ride did. Now, my quantitative mind cannot look at periods of rest. Can only look at periods of action.
Correct.
This is the unlearning I had to do for 10 years. And I still make the mistake today. Still, I will go in with a quantitative mind and learn something from a weaver.
My gosh.
So, I mean, I won't give you the theoretical example, but, this is the kind of unlearning. So basically, what I'm trying to say is it's both together, always. We in our modern way of knowing have split them.
Yes.
And in splitting them, we think we can grasp everything in one frame. We cannot.
Correct.
Annapurna, if I can ask a different set of questions from the viewers.
Yeah.
Two questions. One from Avni, who asked, do weavers from different states often collaborate and combine practices? There's another from Jehan instead, who asked, do big brands like Sabyasachi support traditional handlooms, or do smaller brands that sell volume like Charmas benefit the weavers?
Okay, so the first question is whether they collaborate. Actually, the collaboration is let's take, for example, something like the famous chintz, the Machilipatnam prints. Now, how you would think of a collaboration is that you have a farmer in Gujarat who sends his yarn to a spinner in, who might be spinning in, Gujarat, a Gujarati woman would be spinning. That yarn gets dyed in, Uravakonda, and then it travels to be woven in, or to be resist printed in Machilipatnam. So, there is always collaboration going on in order to produce any single product. It's when the collaboration breaks down that there's a problem. For example, today, what we think of as the single biggest invention of the Industrial Revolution, which is spinning, is the most centralized activity that breaks down all collaboration. Because the farmers now don't know anymore the weavers, because they sell to the mill. The weaver anymore doesn't know where the fabric is coming from. We used to have 72 different types of cotton, at least 72, even 30, 40 years ago. The Ponduru cotton was different from the Gujarati cotton. They all had different textures. They all had different, the diversity. And then for the women, it was no problem. They could spin anything. They could combine any two cottons and create a completely new texture if they wanted. But today the mill won't allow it. 95% of cotton today is a single type of cotton that we use, hybrid cotton. So this question of collaboration at, coming only at the weaver's end is a wrong way of thinking collaboration. Every product is a collaboration. It's only because these collaborations have got centralized and broken down that we are even asking these questions. And of course they collaborate at the product end, but at the product end it is much less. It is that links to the question of Sabyasachi, for example, that you have to have resource in order to run a larger and larger set of collaboration. So if you want to take a sari that's made in one place and have it printed in another place, embroidered in another place, gota in another place, and sold, you can imagine the amount of resource it takes. And once you've put in all that work, you will put your name on it and you will make your money off it. So typically in that kind of market, not even 10% goes to craftspeople. It's not so much about whether Sabyasachi is doing more or Chermas is doing more. It is that when you sell core fabric, basic fabric, you know that 80% is going to producers. It's either going to the cotton farmer or to the weaver. Only 20% is going to all of us, the middlemen. But when you buy something from Sabyasachi, only 10% of it is going. So this is really the way I think to think about it.
First, I want to say these whatever questions I ask are questions from the audience, not from me. I just want to clarify. uh, there's a question here, they want to know a little more about this. Amina asks a question, can you tell us a little more about Yellappa and his recognition through smell? I remember my mother smelling a new sari.
Yeah.
There is another question here again as to, can you tell us something about the connection between color and song?
Okay. So if you use natural materials, those smells will linger, no, in the product. So so basically the thing is, because it's a fermentation process, the indigo dyeing, and you're basically making sure that the culture, it's like making dahi, curds. When you smell curds, when it smell, you know them when it has that kammaga kavasana, they say that in Telugu. It's that perfect neutral kind of happy smell, and then you know the curd is set. If it's not fully set, it will have a different smell. When it's overly set, it has a different smell, right? So, and that is a happy place. When the curd is perfectly set, that smell is a happy place. It's a happy smell, and it gives joy. So when Yellappa smells that thing, his face would lighten, because yeah, this is the smell. It would give him that. And then you knew the color was perfect. Now, Salim still has, even though he has been dyeing for more than 15 years, once in a way he will dip a pH paper into the thing. But those days he would say, Yellappa never needed a pH paper. So when it's that kind of natural material, when the product is right, it smells right. A lot of people think that indigo is very smelly, by the way. So, I mean, I'm not saying that these are all cultivated happy smells in a way. You know, my older son hates curd. So if I told him it has a happy smell, he would not agree. So in a sense, you teach your body that memory of that. So when you smell that thing, it comes back to you, all that happiness. So I can imagine that she was smelling that sari. But now you'll only smell chemicals and I don't know, and store. And
chemicals smell uniformly.
Yes, that's also true. That's also true. It's a chemical smell. The other question was about okay.
Song.
Yeah, color and song. See, I mean, there are many ways to think about it, but that's a bit, you could also take it in a more political sense, because now dyeing, weaving, all these things are embodied activities. So, and they have to be coordinated. So singing is one way of counting. So if you're turning the yarn and in the pot, and you have to turn it 50 times, it could be the length of a song. It could be the repetitions of a song. Some people don't even need the song, they just do it with their breath. They know it, they count through their breath. They know when the time is over because their breath tells them that this much time has elapsed in the vat. Some people sing. Now, that is one kind of song. The other kind of song is you sing off color. You sing songs about color. You know, you have all these different goddesses and they are associated with these colors, and you associate rasa, which is a kind of essence, which comes from song and color and aesthetic. So there is a way in which these are related. Another more, as I said, political thing is that, oppression, the songs of oppression, are not theories. So if you have an oppressed community like the Dalit community, you don't get theory from them, you get song from them. And what is this about? It is about color. Color is race, color is caste. So when you have, so I have heard people singing songs about Neeli and Nalupu, which are blue and black, which basically are talking about identity and color. But they're songs, they're sung, they're not theorized. I don't know if this answers the question. It's a bit abstract, but
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So there's another.
I don't hear you, Ram.
Sujata, you go ahead. You go ahead, Sujata.
Yeah, there's another question. I'm combining 2 or 3 of them together. One is that, have the other countries done a better job of preserving their traditional practices? And, if we were the kind of work that you have done, much more of academic application to it, just not intuitive, but an academic work of this kind has to be done in, say, Hyderabad or India. How can one, particularly in Hyderabad, how can we start this as a discipline? So, are there some lessons that we can learn from the West where they've tried to make it into an academic discipline for systematization and standardization of study and the pedagogy of it and the knowledge acquisition of it and so on?
Yeah. So this is a question after my heart. So the thing is that let's be clear that the way in which the West, if you're talking about the West, when you talk about other countries, Southeast Asian countries, they have preserved, they have living craft still, like we do. But the West, their craft, at least their traditional craft, exists only in the museums. It's not that they don't have craft. They have craft, but it's completely subsumed in the mechanization. So even if there is someone who is picking jeans by hand, in the end, it becomes an intellectual property that goes into science. So the way in which they've conserved this kind of embodied knowledge is only in the museums and only through science. So I would say we have done a better job of.
Are you saying that science is anti-innovation, creativity then?
I'm saying that science is confused.
Sorry.
Because it seeks to standardize constantly and it seeks to keep things stable. And because that is what it's constantly seeking to do, it has to then deliberately innovate in order to not stay stagnant. But that is not the normal stage of knowledge. Knowledge is constantly evolving, actually. The knower is constantly learning. So for the knower, the problem is not to innovate. The innovation is natural for the knower. For the knower, it is stabilizing that becomes more of a issue. So, and then we take this framework from science and we bring it into this way of knowing, and it completely disrupts their way of knowing. So in that sense, it's not anti-innovation, but it's definitely anti-something. So to talk about the idea of discipline, what is interesting is that this discipline is studied as history in the West. It's history of science and technology that has the pedagogy to study craft and traditional knowledge, embodied knowledge, because they don't have those knowledges alive to study in a contemporary. So I'm in a museum in a history department, though I haven't studied history. I have living history. And so whenever, for example, but their theories and their their frameworks to capture this are fantastic. Like at the Max Planck Institute, the department that is studying this kind of knowledge is completely based on Chinese knowledge. My boss, Dagmar, at the Max Planck, Schaefer, is a Chinese scholar, is a scholar of China. She's been studying in China from the age of 19. And she's now the director. Every scholar there is doing Chinese history and history of science and technology. There is no Indian in that group. In that whole department, there is no Indian. And there is no Indian department either. So forget in India, this kind of understanding of trying to bring together this knowledge, these knowledge systems that work for India is not there even in the West. But we have scholars in India who are very fledgling. For example, two colleagues of mine are working in Chennai together, and it's a joy to see them. Shiv Vishwanathan, who is a typical historian of science, rational thinker, working with Sumitra Vasudev, who is a Carnatic classical musician who has studied Sanskrit and music in the traditional Gurukula style, working together on a theory of orality. What orality is, how do cultures that transmit knowledge through orality, what is their pedagogy? How does one explicate their pedagogy? That is what they are working on, the Music Academy. That is the kind of combinations that we need in order to create the kind of knowledge we need. Now, who is going to resource this? Who is going to, find it important? And today's world is very vitiated. Somebody will fund Sumitra for her Indian knowledge. Somebody will fund Shiv for his liberal left thinking. Nobody is going to fund them to work together.
Taking off on your reply here. So do you mean to say what the Germans did with China, they can't do it with India? Because where does Indian scholarship stand at the developing an Indian style for understanding and appreciating Indian crafts? Why can't we have the West understand Indian crafts as what they're doing and where you're working? This is a question.
See, the thing is that China is very, very well resourced today. They are funding their students who study, so their students undergo the regular education in China. They reach a certain level, then they are funded to go to the best universities in the West to learn those methodologies. Those universities are funded by the Chinese. Students are funded. The research itself is funded. And the other thing is that because China is such a growing force, there is an interest in studying China. And these students who come and learn the Western, so they put in 5 years of study into, high level study in China, come here, put in another 5 years, then go back and teach their students. They are setting up journals. They are funding departments all across the world in China studies. The West is not doing it. The Chinese are doing it.
That's interesting. Yeah, Ram.
Annapurna, there's a question from Anita Rampal who asks, don't we need to emphasize that technology is a process and not a product in order to look deeper at the situated activity of production?
See, I agree first. But what I would like to say is that this product, process, place, division is the problem. If we look only at process, then in a way, you might never get the product. And if you don't have the product, see, why is it that today that, the research is all situated in well-resourced places? Because they have made successful products that have got the extra money. So unless you have products that are going out there, unless there is some kind of a way in which there is a balance between the process and product, what is happening with textiles is we are overproducing. There is an over process in a way, and that's why there is over product. So they're not dealing.
It's a personal question, but your good friend Suim is asking, have you had a moment of epiphany while researching?
It's what I live for. And it happens consistently. You stand there and somebody suddenly says something and it's like, wow, I didn't know this. And now I know it. I can relate many such.
Give an example.
Just now, for example, we've been, and I would recommend this film highly. If you would like to watch it, it's on YouTube. I will send you the link. It's part of the Deutsches Museum project that I'm doing called Penelope. These two this group of young people had gone to make a film and on Indian weaving and how Indian weaving is actually knowledge, because that was being done for the Greek weavers through studying Greek poetry, Greek mathematics, Euclid, that kind of sources. But here we wanted to actually go to the weavers, and now the weavers are not talking. So this very bright young researcher decided, okay, let's find weavers who sing. So she went to Gujarat, and they found weavers who sing, and a beautiful film was made. And then she came back and she said, what is interesting is that the older weavers who used to throw shuttle and use natural material, for them weaving gave them a sense of community. But for the younger weavers who today use more mechanized looms, or the jacquard weaver in Chirala who's just pressing buttons to lift the jacquard, I mean, is it even handloom? For them, for the Chirala weavers, there is no sense of community at all. For the weavers, younger weavers in Kutch, who are using the fly shuttle, but who are singing, the singing is giving them a more sense of community than the weaving. And I thought, what is happening here? And then she said, I don't know how it came about even, but in the conversation, but suddenly I understood that it is that motion, and it is that algorithm that feel that I was talking about in my theory, that is possible only in the throat. It's not possible when you're pressing buttons. So that kind of innovation, that kind of knowledge becomes operational only when you're in that space doing those things. That is why that throw shuttle gives him that innovation. That is why the throw shuttle is important. It's not just because it's some romantic thing of old technology, that some meditative mystical thing. It is the physical possibilities that come from that. So that was a moment of my epiphany for me.
I want to go back to your talk, if I may.
Yes.
When you see Paithani and Jamdani is still done in Gujarat, right? So on what basis does Upada? Upada is very, very clearly, when you see Upada Paithani, you can make out that it is from Gujarat's Paithani and Jamdani. It doesn't at all appear to me that it was a bright innovation that just emerged from Upada itself. So how did they get a GI tag and call it innovation when it was really a very good imitation, in my opinion?
Exactly.
Not an imitation with a little bit of maybe
adding
their own little
yes,
knowledge.
Absolutely. But the thing is that the patterning of Gujarat only does Jamdani in the border.
Maybe, but the technique is the same, no? The concept and the technique.
Yeah, but see, this is the point. When you split technique, product, place, process, this is what happens. That's why the GI doesn't hold, actually. Even though weavers desperately try and get it and use it, it doesn't hold because the technique will travel. The technique traveled, the Jamdani technique traveled not just from Gujarat pattern, it came all the way from Dhaka. The actual all over pattern that you're seeing today in Jamdani, in Uppada, comes from Dhaka.
Right.
So it's that, and the techniques will travel. That's how the knowledge spreads, because people will travel. But then they do something else to it from that place, from that material, from the repertoire. They will do something to it. And it will keep changing. So trying to stabilize it and say, this is not going to work. But at the same time, we have our sambars, we have our rasams, we have our biryanis.
So you don't think it was an incremental addition, it was a new product. I mean, I'm trying to see from, the drug's point of view.
Yeah.
When a drug is made, the basic chemical drug, and these so-called innovators like Novartis and all just add one more compound, and then they have been under section, in our Drug Act, we allow patent if it is an innovation. And Supreme Court has always said nothing doing, it's not an innovation, you only added a little bit more to a basic known knowledge component. So where would this kind of fit in? Is it just an incremental addition to a known traditional technique that's going from place to place that each one is adding? Or do you see real outburst of creativity which is unique to it?
I'm going to answer that question slightly tangentially. Now, the thing is that why do you need a patent? You need a patent because you want to own that knowledge.
Well, to support innovation is the argument given.
Yes, to support innovation, you have to be able to own it so that you can sell it.
Yeah.
So the patent is not about knowing, it's about owning that knowledge.
Yes.
Okay. So when we are fighting over patents, we are not fighting over who knows. We are not actually fighting over whether it's an innovation or not. We are fighting over whether you can own that innovation or not.
Yes.
Right? Now, what is innovation? Innovation is fixing a particular moment in time and a product and saying this is new.
Yes.
But is anything completely new ever? No. So we have created a process where we have said, this is the moment where this is new, which we are deciding. And then because you fix that moment and you fix the person who has made that new something, that knowledge becomes ownable. Because then that person can sell it as a patent. So all the battles that we are having that we think is about knowing, about innovation as knowing, and this is the ownership of knowledge book that is coming out from MIT Press, and we've elaborated this at great length. This is not an issue of knowing, this is an issue of owning knowledge, and our splitting owning and knowing as if knowing is of science and owning is of law is what is making this trouble.
There's a question here. Any ideas about education system in India and the integration of the pedagogy that comes from the weavers? There is this wonderful syllabi in the Coimbatore Institute on handloom. I'm sure you're familiar with that. You can take off on that.
See, the 3 million handloom weavers today who are weaving never went to any school. It's a hereditary knowledge that is taught at home. It doesn't even count as knowledge. Before you think of taking it into pedagogy into schools, I would think we should think, how can we recognize it as pedagogy in the home of the weaver? I'm not saying that we should not take it to schools. Of course, we should take it to schools. But we have thrown art out of school. We have thrown craft out of school. We have thrown music out of school. When we have thrown all those very mainstream things out of school, I am thinking taking handloom weaving into school is a very, very distant proposition. It's very good. It should be done. That there is no question.
Yeah.
I think we have, there was one questions have disappeared. Well, very mundane question, Annapurna, if you don't mind asking. You said some weavers are successful and others not so successful. What is the difference in their approach?
Okay, so this is, I'm going to also answer this a little bit using the framework that I've set up of smell, memory, and song. So when we first started work, when I first started doing, when I started going into the PhD process, one of the things that I found very difficult about our sector is that we don't agree. None of us. We all are prima donnas. We are all running either NGOs or design, whatever. We don't agree. Now, so there's a cacophony. Somebody is saying you should museumize. Somebody is saying you should mechanize. Somebody is saying standardize. Somebody is saying develop. Somebody is saying this, that, and the other. So as an engineer and a scientist and a rational thinker, I felt we need one single answer, one single way of understanding weaving that will allow us to be successful. That is a successful route. We'll pick a weaver who has been successful, we'll model him, and that will be the success. Now, for that, all these people have to agree. It's not happening. We are not going to agree. So then I started thinking of this whole idea of the hank yarn and the coordinating standard. Then I realized that actually what you have is you have all these different groups. You have the state, you have the market, you have the weaver, you have the designer, you have the consumer. Or think of them all sitting in a circle. Now the state, in its form as wanting to empower weavers, decides to set up cooperatives, work with cooperatives, fund cooperatives. The cooperative believes in collective enterprise. So it works with weavers. If that weaver believes in flexibility and works with a consumer who wants a diverse product, then that is a set of players within which the weaver will be successful. Let's take the same state in its mode of modernization, working with a market that goes towards mechanization, working with a master weaver who wants to, or a designer who wants to, make profits only, working with a weaver, turning them into just labor, getting less and less labor, less and less wages. In that constellation, the weaver is unsuccessful. I don't know if this answers the question, but this for me is a way to think about success and failure.
Yeah, I think.
Never miss our updates and be part of our conversation squad.